Today on the Self Smarter podcast.
When you're proactive about establishing boundaries, again, you shouldn't be creating a barrier. You should be creating, inviting people to have a more thoughtful interaction with you.
Hi, we're Danelle and Megan, the hosts of this conversation-centric podcast for leaders seeking to be better every day. Whether you choose to be a leader in the workplace, at home, or in your community, we believe the most effective leaders are equipped to not only be self-starters, but self-smarter.
Hello, and welcome to Self Smarter. I'm Megan, and this is my co-host and friend, Danelle.
Hello, everyone.
Good day to you.
Well, thank you. Good day to you.
I don't want to say good morning or afternoon because I don't want to be distinctive about that.
Okay.
Because you never, it doesn't matter.
No.
If you're listening to this, it doesn't matter
Just
what time of day.
Good old day to you.
Just a day.
Yeah.
That's right. But you did say it was beautiful there.
It's beautiful in New York today. Yes, I'm in New York.
Like, how beautiful is it? Is it like 65, not a cloud in the sky? Is it?
I think it's 61 degrees, which is insane. It's a little bit cloudy today, but I'll take it all day long. It's going to rain tonight, but yeah, it's beautiful.
So does this mean you're going on an epic walk after this?
Oh, yeah. I'll be putting some feet to the pavement, that's for sure.
Woo! Awesome. You know what I was thinking about? I've just, how I think about random things.
Mm-hmm.
I think about random things and then I don't tell you about them and then I save them for the recordings. But I was thinking recently about, as long as I've known you,
Mm-hmm.
I don't think you've ever attended, that I'm aware of, a high school reunion. And the reason I'm bringing this up is because my 30 year, which is hard to believe in and of itself, is coming up next year.
Wow.
And you have yet to attend a 10, a 15, a 20, a 25.
Well,
What's up with that?
Well, it's just, there's just boundaries, and there's boundaries and I have established a boundary around my high school. No, I'm just kidding. I don't think that I think we tried maybe year 5. I don't know, it's a little foggy. But I mean, Meg, I graduated with 42 kids and 5 born babies. We just had other priorities, like getting out of school and doing life. So yeah.
So 42 teenagers plus 5 children. So 47 technically graduated.
Yeah. Yes, it was. And we were the largest class to ever graduate from the high school, was 42.
Wow.
So yeah, it was, it's just not something that I think I do admire when schools, keep that stuff up. And then I know that you've gotten excited about going, and I love to hear the stories afterwards. But yeah, it's just not something that we ever were able to establish and maintain.
Fun fact. I just am thinking of this.
Okay.
I went to high school at the same place that our former First Lady, Laura Bush, went.
Oh, okay.
And graduated.
Midland, right? Midland Lee?
Midland Lee. Yeah, it's not called that anymore. Now it's called Legacy High.
Oh, they changed the name. Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, but I went to Midland Lee in West Texas. Holla, those of you that are listening. I know they do because I can see it in the analytics. So
yes.
Hope I'm making them proud. I hope you're making your friends back home very proud. If they're listening, they probably aren't because you never show up to the reunions.
Well, I don't think there are reunions. Can I just say that? Like, they don't exist.
Yeah.
They don't exist.
I think we're about to start one.
All right. I'll think about that. I think you're a little, how's that? Yeah. How's the meds going?
The meds are going well. So just for people listening, I'm not on any kind of crazy meds. I'm on ear infection meds.
Oh my gosh. The best.
Yes. And what's funny is my husband, I don't, those of you that are listening, I'm sure some of you have ear infections, but Aaron's like, I don't know any adult that has an ear infection as much as you do. Like, what is up with you? You're like a 3-year-old. And I guess I kind of am. But what I love about, I hate an ear infection. It's the worst I've had in my whole life. But what I love about an ear infection is the steroid drugs.
Oh, yes. That is a beautiful week-long high. I get so much done.
So much done. And I'm telling you, my ear is almost like new. It's not quite.
Boy.
Like, I'm still a little swollen underneath.
Yeah.
I can see it.
Okay.
So it's It's a naughty one.
I could use a little dose of steroids or some things I really need to get taken care of. And boy, I am so productive on those things. I'm sure that's not the right thing to say, but I'm telling you that I feel like Superwoman.
Well, I woke up at 6:30 this morning, eyes just wide open. That never happens. I'm usually like, oh no, and I was ready to do all the things like organize. I was like, oh, this closet sure does need to clean out. Oh boy, this pantry sure does need to clean out. That's the steroids talking. That's not normal me.
Oh, awesome.
But I love her.
Yes.
I love it when steroid Meg comes to town. Who knows what we'll accomplish at work today?
We'll get so much done. It's going to be amazing. I can't wait. I'm gonna draft off of your energy.
Yay! Okay, good. All right. Well, while we're drafting off my energy, I hope that those of you listening will draft off the energy in this quick commercial.
Hi, Self Smarter listeners. Did you know 61% of website users expect to find what they're looking for within 5 seconds of landing on your website? And that's just for starters. People in a position to buy largely use the internet to search for solutions, and if your website isn't able to deliver the information or guide the visitor quickly, odds are you're losing business. I want to encourage you to contact our web team ASAP to take advantage of our free website scorecard. This service will grade your website to guide your online marketing strategy by uncovering your website's potential by scoring major categories of your website, like your messaging, the functionality, the analytics, how it's designed, and finally, we look at your goals and determine if your website is positioned to convert visitors into sales. This is 100% free to you, dear listener. So contact me, Mary Cobb Manriquez, at info@dma-solutions.com, and I'll schedule a call to get us started.
Okay, Dee, today we're talking about boundaries and the problem with boundaries. So it's the hot buzzword, right? Boundaries.
Yeah.
I feel like I don't remember exactly when it became hot, but I feel like it's been either during or since the bad word, the pandemic.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like it kind of really creeped up. I guess people needed more boundaries.
Yeah, no,
I don't know.
I feel like, I think it was heightened for sure. I think boundaries has been part of, vocabulary for a while. And it's, to me, it was always a very narrow topic, which is why we actually want to explore it today. But definitely during the pandemic, or I should say 2020 and into 2021, it became a lot more prevalent because it was necessary. We were all living under the same roofs, and there was just a lot going on relative to people's physical space and emotional capacity. So I think, yes, it became extremely heightened.
Mm-hmm. And I really think there are, and this is something that you and I have talked about, that there's a lot of misnomers or maybe just misclassifications of what boundaries are. So we're going to talk about that today, and we're going to dive into how we view boundaries and offer up some advice for everybody.
Yeah.
So why don't we kick it off, Dee, by tell me why boundaries are important.
I think they're important because ultimately they are a form of self-care. And with them, when we have them established and we understand them for ourselves, we're taking care of our mental health, and we're seeking affirmation that, our well-being is being respected, quite honestly, by yourself and by others. So I think that's the simplest and the most important reason why boundaries should exist. Because without boundaries, our work and personal relationships can become really difficult to manage. And as a result, the happiness and satisfaction that we can seek can be very difficult to achieve. And the thing about boundaries is I think that they're simplistic in nature, but what they require is just a lot of self-understanding and reflection. And that's where we can sometimes get boundaries, we let things go too far, and then all of a sudden we realize we need a boundary, which is why we want to talk about this in this episode, is so that we can be more proactive with establishing and understanding the boundaries that we need to be, the best version of ourselves, but then to also be able to understand them and receive them from others. So, and I think one of the cautionary tales of boundaries is when they become a crutch. So they shouldn't come from a place of depravity, in my opinion. I believe that they should come from a place of abundance. because what they should do is allow you to receive the things that you need. And boundaries just, I don't know, we've had this episode teed up for a while, but I just could not get my arms around why I was irritated by the topic. If I'm being completely honest about this subject, it's because I have witnessed boundaries be used almost in a reactionary, as I said, reactionary way, and used as a crutch when someone just wants to not deal with something, or all of a sudden they want to change the dynamic of a relationship. All of a sudden there's a boundary issue. So I just, again, I wanted to think in a more healthy way about it. And obviously we did some research getting ready for this, and I actually learned a lot. And so I'm excited to share this with our listeners. And I think what's important and what we really also want to elevate today is that as leaders, we need to understand our own boundaries, but we also need to seek to understand other people that we're leading, their boundaries, or other people that we're in a relationship with. And I think we can forget to do that, or not forget, but we can just overlook that. And I think sometimes we'll be in an interaction with someone who knows what their boundaries are, but oftentimes they haven't done the work either. So it then can become a mutual conversation to establish those things, and so, or establish what's necessary for each of us to feel healthy and to be healthy.
Yeah, that's great. I agree. Concur 100%. What about the problem with boundaries? So that's what we're talking about today. It's really in terms of the way we / society talk about them today.
Yeah, like I said, I think it's because, first of all, we frame boundaries as a bad thing. And so immediately when you say boundary, what do you think of?
Like defense.
A fence, like a place that no one else can go. And in my opinion, I think when you're offensive or when you're proactive about establishing boundaries, again, you shouldn't be creating a barrier. You should be creating, inviting people to have a more thoughtful interaction with you. And therefore when you seek to understand other people's boundaries, you should be getting closer to them, not further. But I just feel like most of the time, what I have understood from my own personal relationships, or, reading about boundaries or trying to study about the subject, a lot of information out there is how to establish them, and it almost seems like how to keep people further away from you. And we'll dive into that where I think that has stemmed from, because boundaries sometimes are about space. But at the same time, that doesn't mean that because you need time to do certain things, for instance, and again, we're gonna give some examples here in a bit, but I think it just automatically puts boundaries as establishing a limit. And I really wanted to challenge that today. I want to challenge it to where when you establish a boundary, you really are inviting more, because if you're able to exchange, if someone in your life is able to understand what you need, then that means when you should have a stronger interaction with that individual. And so I also think that, and again, to kind of touch on that point a little bit deeper, is that I have seen boundaries more so as barriers. And I don't think that boundaries should be used as a way to keep someone out or away from you. In fact, I think it's about inviting people to be closer to you because they understand what you need. And I think obviously this podcast is centered around leadership for the most part in the workplace, but we're humans, and we want to talk about emotions and psychological needs that we have as humans. And so I think that this episode really should be more so about any relationship that you have, because boundaries are needed, whether you're talking about a coworker or with a manager or a director or someone that anybody you have an interaction or relationship with. And that could be, couples, friendships, etc. And I think too, boundaries show the other person in a nutshell, basically, how to be successful with you and to let them know what has happened in the past to be a problem. So when you're establishing your boundaries and trying to understand them for yourselves, most often, at least it's mine, I'd be interested in your opinion as well. When I think about my boundaries, they've come from a place of when I've been made to feel uncomfortable. So therefore, there's a boundary. And so a lot of those that I've established for myself come from, oh, that was just not a healthy interaction. And, a great and easy example of that is me moving to New York City and being closer to Mackie Payton, my adult daughter. And we had to figure out what our boundaries were. I don't remember us sitting down and having an actual conversation where the word boundary was used.
Right.
But it took us a while to kind of figure out, well, what's the cadence for communication now that I'm here in the city and I'm, 10 minutes away? Or how often will we see each other? And at the same time, learning to be two adults in a relationship. Yes, we're still mother and daughter and we're very close in that way. But we had to also figure out what are our boundaries as two adults. And she's this independent woman in New York City. Now I'm here. We had to figure those things out. And it's interesting, as we studied and prepared for this episode, there were things that I picked up on that I was like, that would be helpful for Mackie and I to discuss. And I think that's the other thing that we tend to, that make boundaries a challenge, is that they may be there and that you may have them established for yourself, and then you don't communicate them until someone oversteps a boundary or, it interferes. Then all of a sudden you're like, well, that just crossed a boundary for me. And all of us have been on that, both sides. And it's a sinking feeling when you're like, wow, we could have avoided that because that's not my intention. And so again, I hope that we're going to talk about boundaries in a more realistic way versus the 80% of the articles you find out there are all the things you need to do to establish distance is most often what I read. And not to say the distance isn't important, but it can't just be about that. We've got to learn how to communicate our needs and be interested in what others are. So that's what I would say.
I'm going to get real vulnerable.
Yeah.
Because as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking about my life and communication, which boundary setting, first of all, I don't think that this is a misnomer. I think that some people easily find the strength and courage to set the boundary verbally or have the conversation like you and Mackie had. And I think other people who worry about confrontation, again, and it's not just because of my Enneagram type, or maybe it is, but I think growing up, I wasn't invited to have boundaries. There were no boundaries. I was the kid. I was the teenager. I was the young adult. You do what I say, right? So I think as we have X-Gen, people are evolving, and now we're evolving as parents. We either do want this for our children or we don't. I think there's probably people who are raising children the way that I was raised, which is you don't really get a boundary. Like, this is what happens. The door stays open. You eat your supper and that's what you do. Make good grades. That's that, right? There's no debate. Now, as a parent of a 16-year-old like you with Mackie, a young adult, they just know this term. And so they're being taught, I think, that they're supposed to have this ability to be able to negotiate. At their age, they should be negotiating boundaries with their parents. And so I'm doing this for the first time and feeling like it's necessary, because I want I want my son to be able to have the freedom of setting boundaries. The lack of being able to set boundaries in my life up until my adulthood. And then I had, I'm talking like 30 years old, 35 years old. I figured out I didn't have them at all. And I didn't know how to set them. And I didn't know what that was. I didn't know what that was. And as a result, I think I can tend to let people not take advantage, but for sure, I don't know, creep into my comfortable barrier, I guess, without a better term of putting it. And so I just think that this is so important for so many reasons. I think there are some people that are wired one way. I think there are some people that are wired other ways. But the fact that we all know that we need them is step number one, right?
Yeah. Acknowledging that this is something that can help us in every relationship that we have.
Everything.
Right. And I think we have to rethink it, because I don't think we're alone in not necessarily understanding why they were important or what they even are. And then I don't think we're alone in thinking of them as almost in this negative way. And so again, I haven't thought of boundaries as negative, but we've been in that position where you're on the receiving end of, you crossed a boundary with me, like, and then the intention probably wasn't there. But, and again, we're talking about, and again, not serious issues here. I'm talking about like more of time, or, and I mean, boundaries aren't just about time or physical space. They're also, boundaries need to be established in many different areas of our lives. I mean, you can think of money, you can think of managing family dynamics. If there's, an interesting makeup to a family, and a family is determined by a group of people who determine that. It doesn't always necessarily have to be your blood family. And so I think there's that. I think there's cultural differences, and I know we're going to go through some, but I think that a boundary should be seen as a tool that we proactively use to have stronger relationships, period.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So if you're not setting them amongst your friends, your people in your life, or yourself, and I know you're going to talk about that too, what are you missing out on? That's the question I'm walking away with. So let me ask you this, Danelle. What advice do you have to give to people that struggle with setting boundaries? And I think it's not an easy thing. I just want to call a spade a spade. Like, it's not easy to set boundaries sometimes. So what advice do you give to people like me?
I would say this. I would say the most important thing is you have to know yourself. And this this journey of self-awareness and self-knowledge that, we talk about, and, we basically established this podcast to elevate those types of things, is that getting to know yourself is required, in my opinion, to understand what your boundaries even are, and in order to set them. So how, can we do that? It's like, once we know who we are, and sometimes that reflection, and again, I think boundaries are a lot of reflection work, because you have to think back on times where you felt really comfortable.
Yes.
And times where you didn't feel comfortable. And I do think, again, seasons of life change these dynamics. So it's not something that once they're established, they're there forever like a tattoo. This is something that I think you have to work on, as, again, mine and Mackie's relationship was very different when we were both living at home in Texas together versus what it is living here. And that's just one example. Or boundaries in a workplace when a dynamic has changed. I think it's responsible for leaders, and I'm assuming that's why you're here, if you're listening, is whether you're a leader, at work or at home, it's important to check in with yourselves, and that, that boundary used to be like this for me, or this is what I needed. And this could be something simple as, I used to need to close my door in order to get certain things done. Well, that was a boundary that now that I look back and reflect, it was a boundary I needed in order to think more clearly.
Totally.
However, if as a leader, I'm sitting there with the door closed in an office full of, 20 or less people, if I'm not communicating necessarily why that time is important to me, that can be perceived as a barrier. Versus, I need this time to go focus on these certain things. And again, I think we'll get into some more examples, but that's just, we need to be able to be agile. We have a whole episode on agility, and I think it's important. Boundaries are one of those things that we need to, first of all, set them as our reality exists today. Understand them, and that comes from a reflection of, when do I feel the most energized and the most fulfilled? with the relationships I have in my life and when am I drained. And that should be the work that helps you understand it. And then I think, it also stems from, if you're doing that work, what are your values and what do you value in a relationship or in the workplace that strengthens you. And then obviously, what are your priorities in life? If you're aiming to run a business someday, you may want to invest time and energy into learning at work and being someone that, doesn't check out or,
Yes.
out of the job and hop from place to place. You know what I'm saying? So it's, again, your values, what are your priorities? And then also understanding what are you willing to be flexible about? Mm. And I like to say this, and I know you've heard this 100 times, and this is a way that I have learned to deal with, I'll loosely say, problems or challenges through the years, and help. I use this a lot in coaching, is this whatever is happening, is this for now or forever? And I think you have to understand the need for a boundary can be seen that way. So I may, and in our relationship, for instance, it may, on any given week, if we're dealing with something, I may normally know that one of your boundaries may be you want to drive home, you want to listen to a podcast or come into work, whatever. And, or maybe you want to talk to your personal, your friend or your mom or whatever. Mm-hmm. But there could be a situation, you name it, you fill in the blank, where I need to say, Meg, I know that you value that time. This is the only time slot I have found for us to be able to discuss this topic, whatever it may be. And that could be in a business, or it could be me personally needing some time from you. I think if I understand that a boundary for you, you've communicated to me, I really need that drive home to decompress so that when I get home, I'm showing up my best for Aaron and Cooper, Sadie, whatever it may be. And then I respect it enough to say, is it okay for us to have this conversation on the way home? 9.9 times out of 10, you're going to absolutely say yes. Doesn't mean that boundary doesn't exist. And it doesn't mean that from then on that I should just be able to call you every time I know you're getting in the car. So I think, and I don't know that it's always that formal of asking. Once you're in a deep relationship with someone, as we are, you instinctively know. Like, she doesn't want to call me every night on my drive home. There's a reason. Yeah. There's a reason she's doing it today. But that being said, when you're forming new relationships, again, wherever you are, I think it's critical if we can start doing this sooner. I think of the relationships that are strained in my life, if I could have learned how to communicate this sooner and in a more effective way, I think some of those strains that I've experienced wouldn't have been there. And I can tell you it's equal parts personal and professional that I reflect back on and I think, wow, that was a boundary issue.
Yeah.
That riff was caused because we weren't able to communicate.
Maybe. Yeah. I mean, I think you're making a good point in what's surfacing for me. Like, you used us as an example. That's a good example of a friendship, a working relationship over a long period of time, 15 plus years. Yeah. So we've learned how the respect and the trust. So there's that. But then you switched over to talking about new relationships. And I think that's critical because there really isn't that earned respect and trust just yet. So you could potentially argue that you use setting boundaries as a way to form the respect and the trust.
Absolutely. I mean, being able to communicate that, and I have a lot of new relationships in my life these days, living here and meeting new people that are completely different from different worlds and different perspectives than I am, and have different scenarios of life. And this is something that I know as I continue to foster deeper connections with people, which is a big part of this chapter of my life. It's something I don't want more relationships. I just want to have deeper connections with people. This is part of that. And I think, knowing what my boundaries are and knowing and seeking to understand theirs, it's only going to make that deeper connection, it will happen faster.
Totally.
Because again, it's proactively setting people up to build trust.
Yeah, to serve you in that way, the way you need to be served. And I think younger people in Gen Z, specifically Mackie Payton, we've seen this. I know that she has conversations amongst her peer group at this point where they talk about these things. They don't say, I have a boundary where, I don't walk past 7th Avenue at a certain, they don't do that, but they say, here's what makes me comfortable relative to this topic. Here's what makes me uncomfortable. They're very open and sharing so that anybody in that group now knows, okay, Maggie doesn't walk past 7th Avenue at this time, after this time of night. I'm making it up, but, and I know Cooper's friend group is doing the same. They don't say, well, I'm setting a boundary, but they say, hey, we don't do this, or I don't like this after us, this, or I do like this. And I'm watching them, I'm listening to, when I listen to Mackie and she shares with me, and they don't even realize what they're saying, to me. But what I'm picking up vibes on is that they are able to more effectively have these conversations sooner than I did. And I respect that.
Yes, I do. I do believe that it's absolutely a strength of this up and coming generation. I think it's going to serve them well.
Right. So if you're leading and you're like, I'm going to use me as an example because this is not something I would say that I'm very gifted at doing, but I am a leader hands down at this business and in my home life too. And I'm having to learn almost by watching and taking input, but your generations that are coming into the workplace expect it.
Right. Absolutely.
Right. They're coming in with these expectations. And so now's the time for us to get our arms around this. If you're like me and you struggle with it.
Yep.
So are there different types of boundaries we need to know?
Yeah, I think, and again, I read and consume content from a website called Better Up, and we'll put a link in the show notes because I wanted to talk about the different types of boundaries because in looking, it helped me to kind of organize where boundaries should exist, and I want to share that with our listeners and with you. And I think that when you think about it in this context, you kind of get away from boundary only being, like I said, a physical distance. I mean, you can think about it deeper. And I took a lot from this. So I want to share it. So in this article, they describe 5 different types of boundaries that we should be aware of. And then the first one is emotional boundaries. And emotional boundaries have to do with being clear on what is and isn't to your feel or fix, is the way they say it. And your emotions and emotional well-beings are within your control regardless of what is happening for the other person. So these boundaries help us show empathy and without absorbing the other person's feelings. So again, the emotional boundary helps us to, I don't know how else to say it, but y'all know that I'm visual if you listen to this podcast, but it's almost like it helps us stay steady. Like when we understand what our emotional boundaries are, and obviously with the therapy that helps, is then you are putting yourself in a position to be stronger for other people because you understand your emotional boundaries. So that's the way I look at this particular example.
Yeah. So a good example of this, like at work, this is something I hear a lot is, I'm really overwhelmed with my workload. Like that's probably something leaders that you hear. I'm overwhelmed, or I'm in a place in life where, I'm having a hard time doing the juggling act, the balancing act. It's so easy to just kind of lean into that, to be the empathetic. Yes. What I have found to be successful, I don't know that this is, the boundary for me has become turning it into a solution. So yes, I can empathize with that. I have walked in your shoes, believe that. Here's an example of that. And here's how I'm going to lead you to a solution. So not healthy boundary would be me being like, oh yeah, I'm overwhelmed too. Yeah, I can see why you're overwhelmed. That's a lot of work.
Right.
I bet you're frustrated. Right. So the emotional boundary is yes, I am going to serve you in this moment. You know, because I've worked with you, person across the desk from me for years, that you can tell me and you can trust me with that information. And you can also trust that I'm going to help you.
Right.
I'm not going to wallow.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to help you.
Mm-hmm.
And it's similar for a parent too.
Yeah.
As a parent, I was, when I was studying this Better Up article that you were talking about, this is what they were saying, a parent can build off the mood
Mm-hmm.
of their teenager. And I mean, it literally said that, and I needed it because I have one, right? And you have a young adult, and
Right.
we can be moody,
Mm-hmm.
and we're learning how to navigate that they're learning how to navigate that for themselves. I don't want to base my world around someone's mood.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's an emotional boundary that I'm going to have to figure out, right? Like, so you get to feel this way, son or daughter, and I get to feel this way. You know what I mean? So I'm not going to work my life around this mood. I really like that. That's an emotional boundary.
Yeah, and I think it's important to remember that emotional boundaries in relationships are about maintaining individuality.
Yes.
That's what you're describing. Now, when you're talking about parenting, when that starts to happen and aging, in teens, like, I don't know at what point that when you should start practicing this, but I think it's simple, is that when you start to see that even at a young age, I mean, we have our own thoughts and feelings, and it's important that we can celebrate that, understand that without losing ourselves. And that's what I feel like you're communicating, meaning and the tables could be turned. As a teenager or a young adult, an emotional boundary is to not get weighed down when a parent is struggling. Maybe they're struggling with something personally. Maybe they're struggling with something at work. It's to definitely try to understand what's happening, but it should not. A boundary would be that you're not going to fall into that temporary despair or struggle that person may be feeling. You'll be there, and do what needs to be done. And like, if I think of an example in our household, if I came home and had a bad day, it's not that Mackie needed to sit down and try to understand that with me. It probably meant if ever there was a day to pick up your room and have things straightened up and in order around our house, that might be it. That is literally what they're talking about when you start to study emotional boundaries. It's having the understanding that is necessary in this moment because, someone is in a position to potentially show up in a way that could cause us to take on, like, lose ourselves in their mood or emotion. I was kind of struggling to get that out, but that's the point. So
I like it. Yeah.
So the second one, in terms of describing the types of boundaries that they talk about, and I love this one, is intellectual boundaries. And again, this is a little bit of a repeat, but we all have different beliefs, ideas, and values. And intellectual boundaries help us respect one another's different viewpoints. We need a hell of a lot more of this in general.
Yes.
And so I think it's important that you don't expect people in your lives to share all of your opinions or adapt all of your views. And I mean, you'll talk about some boundaries being overstepped. To me, this one, I had not thought of a boundary like that, but it's when you just refuse to respect someone else's point of view or even hear what they have to say. And that is, to me, an absolute unhealthy boundary. So again, even if you disagree, I think we need to be able to share our opinions and feelings with each other. That is a healthy an exchange to begin with. And where I think, even though the boundary, meaning you may believe one thing, I may believe something else, but to be able to discuss it, that's where, to me, a healthy boundary exists. And knowing maybe when it's time to, I heard you, I appreciate your opinion, I respect it, using the old term, let's agree to disagree.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the old G setting intellectual boundaries. So
yeah, which this is good to hear for people who struggle with conflict. I mean, I view that as, listen, I live with a straightforward six in my house who has a lot of opinions, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And I hear about those a lot. At one point, he said to me, I would like for you to share some of your opinions. Like, don't you think about this stuff? Because I just would listen. I didn't really share any opinions because quite frankly, I was worried because I knew my opinions were different than what he believed. And I didn't want to get into a big, hairy argument.
Are you talking like just an example? Are you referring to politics or
anything? Yeah.
Okay.
Anything.
Okay.
Like, Aaron can find reasons to talk about something on any given day because he absorbs the news and he's always concerned about the world. And that's good. That's very, very good for him.
Right.
So he wants to talk about it. Well, I don't always agree on perspectives and opinions, but I don't necessarily say anything. So finally he was like, would you please just share what you think? And I'm not going to judge you. Like, I'm not going to think any differently. Actually, I'll probably respect you a little bit more for having a care. So just hear me, people who are afraid of confrontation and this intellectual boundary. Sometimes we almost have to show up in order to keep that. It's communication, but it's also, he's like, do you even care that and I'm like, yeah, I absolutely care. Do you have opinions? Yeah, I have opinions. I just don't want to disagree with you. And he's like, come on, like, bring it.
But I think the point you made that he invited not only to share your opinion, but the most important part of that, and this is what I would classify as an emotional boundary, is that I'm not going to think any less of you if your opinion's different than mine. I invite that, and it may make me think. Your opinion could make me stronger in what I believe, and so that's what I think it's important that we have to feel secure in holding our own opinions. And sometimes we just want to be, you're describing, you just don't want to have confrontation. Others, we do that because we want to be liked. And so if we just agree or not raise any difference in a particular conversation or in a discussion, you are really, you're not remaining true to yourself when you do that. And to me, again, I might have skipped over this at the beginning of the episode. Most often what I found in studying about boundaries and learning more about them ourselves is we tend to lose our own boundaries more often sometimes than others infringing on them, meaning we infringe on our own boundaries. We let them, we put them aside so that we can be liked or that we can avoid confrontation. And I think that's something to keep in mind. And I think, too, when you're thinking about intellectual boundaries, you're like, well, I don't know if I have those. Well, just think about times where you find yourself in an argument or a disagreement. That's a good, when you're reflecting about, what are my boundaries in this particular instance, think about moments of that. Like, what led to an argument? What led to hurt feelings? What led you there? And what could you have established to keep you from doing that? I just had this discussion with someone that I have a strong relationship with in my life. And it was like, we did not agree. And reflecting on that, I thought we could have avoided that if we would have just established this. And so we did. And in that exchange, we're like, when we're talking about these certain topics, we have to keep these things in mind for you and for me, because we're not necessarily exactly aligned. So and again, I'm using a kind of a very broad, real example, but because we've been doing this study, I was able to say, hey, we need a boundary here. And it didn't feel icky. It didn't feel weird. It wasn't coming from a place of scarcity or we've got to do less of this type of discussion. No. It meant more. And we were able to really think through it more and, days later have an even more thoughtful conversation around it that literally strengthened our relationship. So I would just wanted to share that with listeners is because I'm trying to become more conscious of this, and the way that I have found for myself in establishing boundaries is often that reflection comes from, when did things not feel good? When did you hurt someone's feelings, or when did you overstep you do that, or when did that happen to you? That's where a lot of this work can, this realization can come from. The third boundary that they describe are physical boundaries. So we all have different levels of comfort when it comes to physical touch. And so some may be comfortable with hugs in the workplace, for example. Others may not appreciate physical touch in this context. And, speaking up about your physical boundaries at work with your friends is important and totally okay. And obviously we're using work, but I think it could be anywhere. There's those I was raised to hug. I just met someone for the first time the other day, and they were with a great friend of mine, and my instinct is to hug. When I did it, I literally stepped back, and I was just like, "Oh, I've been looking forward to meet you," and I just went in for the hug, and they're like, "Oh, I'm a hugger too." So you know what I'm saying? So sometimes it's just easier, and that can happen. That can happen in any exchange, whether it's the workplace or otherwise. So again, I think it's understand that if you can almost, in that moment, what I did was I respected them by saying that might not have made you comfortable. That's just naturally how I do it. But if that's not okay with you, then I totally respect that. But it just so happened we both were huggers, so it doesn't matter. But I think physical boundaries, are important. And I'm a toucher, meaning not touch people in a bad way, but like in the office, I like to walk by and pat someone on the back and say, "It's so good to see you." Or, and now that I'm here in New York, when I'm in the office, I want hugs. But I also know people around the office, and I know how they're wired. And sometimes it doesn't matter. Sometimes I'm just going to, because it does always matter, but I'm still going to go in for a hug. And if they don't want to hug me back, they don't have to. But again, we have an ingrained amount of trust between, in our workplace. So it's a little bit different. But I think physical boundaries are important. All of these boundaries are important when you're establishing physical relationships, but it's pretty easy to broach that conversation. Are you a hugger? Or, hey, I like to, pat you on the shoulder. Are you comfortable with that? That's a natural instinct for me. And communicating that as a leader, you need to understand that. And some people are like, keep your hands completely away from me at all times because whatever. It doesn't matter what the reason is. That's what makes them comfortable. Then I would say in that instance, if someone's like, I do not want to be patted on the back, I would be like, I am going to promise you I'll do my darndest. But if I do it, just please call it to my attention, because sometimes it's just natural instinct.
This is a hard one. Mm-hmm. This is, and I think we need to reframe or rethink or rewire our brains. I mean, all of this that you just said, it makes complete sense to me, but I'm telling myself, and probably for some people who know someone in their lives who doesn't like to be hugged or touched, that's okay. Yeah. Like, we have to understand that that's not about me who wants to hug you. That's about, and you who doesn't want at all to be touched by somebody. Mm-hmm. And I have to respect that, right? Like what you're saying. And so I just think there's maybe a social rewiring we have to do to remind ourselves that that's 100% okay.
Yeah. And I think, gosh, we could go so deep with this one because you get into cultural differences, you get into, I mean, we can't, unpack all that, but then you get into the difference between male and female, and there's just when we dealt with an issue, a major boundary being crossed the other evening while we were out. And, but I think that's not the type of boundaries we're talking about necessarily in this episode.
I don't know.
I mean, to some degree, yes, but then you tip over into harassment.
That's right. No, our friend was touched by a stranger and we didn't like it. You particularly didn't like it, but that's usually what you do, is stand up for the underdog. Yeah. And it did not go well.
Right. That's harassment. So again, do what?
You said you shouldn't touch people who.
No, I address, and I don't want to go off on this tangent, but just so our listeners are like, ooh, what happened? I addressed the gentleman and I addressed the owner of the establishment we were in. And I said, I think this is unacceptable in this day and age.
It is.
For that to happen. And I think you should go apologize. And then I think you should kick him out. Well, the apology never came. In fact, some explicits came, but the manager believed me and escorted him out. So
Yeah.
he was gone. Again, those are boundary issues that are literally harassment. So
Yeah,
I very
But still,
different.
You wouldn't take it.
Right. But I do think that we have to think about them, physical boundaries, as being something that, in a context of a relationship,
Yeah.
whether a coworker or you know, someone you work with, someone that you are in a group with. I mean, these type of things can actually happen in any scenario, between friends and church group, on your sports teams, you know, like on sports teams, I can't tell you how many times I was patted on the back or the behind, you know, and did that bother me in that moment, in the game, coming out of the game, going into the game? No, not at all. You know, I could probably name 10 other moments when that wouldn't be okay, you know, even in a sporting setting. So I think it's just being a little bit more aware of what you're comfortable with may not be something that someone else is comfortable with, and owning that, being able to communicate. I like to shake hands. I'm a hugger. I like to pat people on the back. Knowing that about yourself is okay, but find people, you know, meet people where they are is the critical point here for leaders of any type. And so the fourth one is one that I love, and I haven't thought about it in this way, but financial boundaries. And, you know, conversations about money don't have to be so scary. I mean, you know this about me, and we've talked about it on this podcast. I love to talk about money, and I think it makes other people completely squirm. And to me, it's just such a, it's so easy to talk about money. And I think what it can be is scary. So I think we have to find ways to create financial boundaries so that you are heard when if you're talking about money. And I think as leaders, it's up to us to explain why there's a boundary around a particular financial, you fill in the blank. And when you don't explain the why behind it, there could be a boundary form that's completely, absolutely unnecessary. You know, like right now, if you know, in our company, we have some boundaries around spending. You know, we're working to meet some other goals that require us to be very conscious around spending. Well, if I would have just said no more spending here and there, like, well, then what's happening? What's going on? Well, you know, and so us establishing those boundaries for our company, we did that and said, here's why this is important. And that way people are invited to respect that and almost protect it. And then they take that on as a boundary as well. So I think those are good examples of, you know, I hadn't thought of financials as being a boundary that we needed to think consciously about.
And I mean, you know, couples deal with this.
Oh, yeah.
You just kind of have to figure it out trial by fire because nobody talks about it. When you get married and you join accounts or you don't, either way, you're going to be talking about boundaries and who's paying for what.
Yeah.
And then I was thinking about when you were talking about financial boundaries, there's this Friends episode, the old Friends show. I'm sure some of you who are listening love it, grew up with it, and maybe you watch it still. But there's this old Friends episode. And I remember thinking when it aired, and I've seen it probably 3 or 4 times since then, but they go to dinner. It's all the friends. They all go to dinner. And I think the more successful of the friend group chose the restaurant, and the restaurant was very nice. And the people that were struggling financially in the group agreed to go and ordered water and a salad. You know, and the others are ordering like all this decadent stuff like lobster thermidor and dessert. And then the check comes. And the 2 that picked the restaurant said, oh, we'll just split it evenly.
Meaning amongst the total group.
The total group.
Yeah, that's a good example.
And that's when the boundary setting came out, right? I had a salad and a water, and she's over here sipping on tea for the last 2 hours. How do you think that's fair at all? So that's the kind of stuff. I mean, that kind of talk was kind of ingrained for us through pop culture, but that's just a really good example of how quickly, if you don't and are unable to set financial boundaries, they can get out of whack.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a great example because I haven't thought about it in that way, but we've all been on both sides of that, probably, most likely, some version of that. So I think that's a good way to frame financial boundaries. And I'll invite all of you, like I said, we're going to put the article. It's in depth, and it does a really wonderful job of helping understand boundaries of all the research that we did. And there's others on there, sexual boundaries, and goes into some more, again, depth that I think is helpful. So I invite you to take a look at that. But these are the ones that we thought we would elevate to our listeners today that certainly helped us, and we hope it helps bring some more context for you around this topic.
Thank you, Danelle. Okay, so just to wrap us up on boundaries today, and I'm sure this is something we can talk about. It's so full of layers, right? We could talk about this again, but what do you know for sure about boundaries?
What do I know for sure? Well, they're absolutely necessary, and they shouldn't always be established in a negative moment. In fact, it should be the opposite. I think we should work to understand what ours are and seek what others are, so that we can avoid having to set a boundary based on something that made us feel uncomfortable or someone else. So I don't think I'd like to, even in my own mind, I'd like to take the negative connotation of boundaries away by being more proactive. And I plan to practice that in both my professional and personal lives. I think it should be a two-way street. And really, boundaries are based on trust and respect. And the only way to truly establish trust and respect between you and another human, let's just say, in any context, is to be able to know yourself and to really truly care to know more about others. And boundaries are actually a great way to establish trust and respect. And I think that ultimately, what I'm assuming that listeners of this podcast, based on the topics we talk about, is that you're seeking deeper connections. And I think deeper connections come from a true desire to know yourself better. And then ultimately, as I said, a sincere desire to know more about others and what makes them feel comfortable and where they may go out of that zone, so into an uncomfortable state. So again, I think this is the work of a self-smarter person, is just to hone these skills. And I feel lucky that there is more understanding and teaching. And I'm extremely excited that the next generation, this is just a natural part of what they do. And so the rest of us may be playing a little bit of catch up with our work, meaning we haven't thought so consciously about boundaries. And again, to your point earlier, I don't know that the young generation is using the word boundary, but listen to them. They know how to set them, or what we should be able to do is help them when they're struggling, that this might be a good time for a boundary, or even when they're succeeding. Absolutely. There's boundaries in that way too. So I think this is a part of our culture that for some of us, it's been seen as being something that is used in a moment of reactive state. And what I want to encourage, starting with myself, all of us to do, is to think about boundaries more proactively. And I think we're going to have deeper connections as a result. Agreed.
Okay. Let's transition to music moment. I'm excited about this today because it's different.
You don't sound excited.
I don't. I
feel like your gear you just down geared or downshifted.
Okay, let me get back up here. I'm so excited about music moments.
There we go. There she is.
We've kind of done this where we talk about different performances we see, or we've played with the hot seat, like where I put you in the hot seat and I ask you some question. We've played with icebreakers. Now I want to play with facts, like fun facts about music.
Ooh, I can't wait.
Yes. So what I thought, I have them written here. I just thought we could just toggle between, like, I'll read the first one, you read the second one. And then we'll end on the third one because it's the best. But these are just fun facts, and we will put the source in the show notes. But I love the first one too. Okay, ready? Here goes my first music fact. In 2016, Mozart sold more CDs than Beyonce. Oh, snap.
What?
Yeah. So the article that we'll put the link in the show notes said in October 2016, Universal Music Group released a box set commemorating the 225th anniversary of Mozart's death. Every box set held 200 CDs.
Whoa.
So just in numbers alone of the purchase with 200 CDs, it sold more than Beyonce.
Okay. I was like, how is that even possible? But still,
I know.
it's you know what? That makes me happy that music is, that much of his music is still relevant and being listened to in the world. That's a good thing.
I think it was like every song he had ever made or something. Like it's like this phenomenal. But then, I'm looking at this stat yesterday and I left it in here, but I'm thinking, who's buying CDs in 2016?
I had that thought for a hot minute. We were already well into streaming by then, so I'm not sure what was going on, but I guess collectors is what I would say, because I definitely don't have a CD player anymore. All right, the other fact that you found is that in this article is that music helps plants grow faster. So thanks for serving me this one. So according to a study by scientists from South Korea, plants grow at a faster pace when classical music plays. Using 14 different pieces of music, the scientists played music to a rice field and studied the results. Findings were that the music helped the crops grow and suggested evidence that plants could hear.
Now, listen, in our everyday lives, Danelle and I work mostly for growers.
We do.
Of plants.
Yeah,
people who
food.
grow our food.
Yeah.
Yes. What if they listen to this and then what if one of the...
Well, what if it was farmers buying all those Mozart CDs to help the crops grow?
There's the rationale.
There's the answer.
There it is.
I could not figure out the correlation. Here we go.
That's right. But if that's the case, audience, are you listening to this? People that we know in the industry, play some of that music for your plants.
Well, your mom has like a super green thumb. You need to let her know this. Her plants.
Yeah, she plays music all the time.
Okay, well then that's probably why she can grow some things. Okay.
That's probably why. Yeah.
Maybe I'll get a plant this spring. There's flowers. I mean, plants are everywhere right now in New York. So maybe I'll get a plant because I'm always listening to music. I hope Brandy Carlisle is what my plant likes.
Well, she loves plants.
No, actually, the study says classical music. Okay.
It does. Yeah,
okay.
I'm sure I'm sure plants would take Brandy Carlisle or this next artist I want to talk about. This fun fact. I know plants, if they love any kind of music, would love the Beatles. But the fun fact is none of the Beatles could write or read music. What?
I didn't.
Mind blown.
Wow.
Paul McCartney finally admitted that neither he nor any of his Beatles bandmates were able to read or write music during a 2018 interview. McCartney said that the music just came to him and his bandmates John Lennon, Ringo Starr, and George Harrison, and it was never written down.
What?
Just think about that for a minute.
I mean, I get the words part of it, but like the music piece of it.
They just played, man. I mean, you know, my son's you know this.
Yeah.
My son's a musician. He does read music. He does.
Mhm.
But that's not where the joy comes from.
Mhm.
The joy comes from the art of it. I mean, to me, what Paul McCartney was saying here is like, it's just coming from a deeper place. I don't know. Like we're just going to play it.
Wow.
This is your role in the band. This is your role in the band. Let's go. I love that.
Yeah, I think, okay, this afternoon on my walk, I'm going to listen to the Beatles with that context and think about their music and the fact that no one could read or write music. Like that, it literally mind blown. I can't wait to share that fact with Mackie Payton.
Yeah.
So, wow, this was fun. I mean, this was good stuff. I didn't know where you were headed with this article, but this is interesting stuff.
Fun facts.
Yeah.
And this is something, if our listeners like it, we'll continue to find some fun facts about music that we can share every now and then, because who doesn't want a good nugget like this to whip out at a bar or a party or on a teenager at
Did
dinner
you know?
Yes. The next
I'm gonna try that out. I'm just on the subway or next time I'm having out a cocktail, because that's a good way for me to get to know people. It's like drop some fun facts. Okay, I'm gonna add it to my repertoire of things I like to say to people for the first time.
Good. Love it. Can you record it? And then we'll play it on the next podcast. The experiment.
How it goes. Okay.
Yes, please. Okay. All right, everybody. Thank you so much for being with us today. Remember, we've been talking about it the whole episode, but Be sure to check the show notes if you're interested in sources. Thank you in advance for telling your friends. We can see that you're doing it because first of all, we hear about it, but then next I can see it in the views. You guys are really listening and it just continues to grow every month. So thank you so much for that.
And I also want to add to when we say show notes, I just want to, because I've had a couple people who are like, well, where are the show notes? So first and foremost, depends on where you listen to the podcast. So it could be if you listen to it on Spotify, there's notes that and information, but you have to hit more in order for it to see that. But the best way to get our show notes is on our website at selfsmarterpodcast.com. Every episode is also housed on our website, and then you can go in and read the show notes there because obviously if you're linking to something, it's easier to do it. Maybe not always on your phone. So those are just a little tip based on questions I've been. Yeah.
Thank you.
Several people lately say, well, where are these show notes? Where do they live?
Yeah. Thank you. That was very helpful. And until next time, we send you into the week with grateful hearts.
Goodbye, everyone.
As always, you can connect with us on Instagram and Facebook at Self Smarter Podcasts. You can also leave a rating or review if you enjoyed what you heard today. Not only does this mean so much to us, but it also helps other leaders and future leaders find our community. Thank you for taking time out of your day to join us in becoming Self Smarter. This podcast is produced by Snacks Media and music is from a free platform. Well, that is until Brandy Carlisle reaches out to us to write the original score for our podcast. Friends, have a great rest of your day.